Hey everybody, it's Mr. Bliss. This video is the second video in a series of videos about macromolecules. This particular video is about our first type of macromolecule, carbohydrates. And from our illustration here, we can see some of the examples of foods that people think of when they do think of carbohydrates. On the left, we have some candy. In the middle, we have pasta. On the right, we have bread. You may also think about potatoes or rice or soda or wheat. And what do these foods have in common? Well, if you were to define them as nutrients, you would say that these are sugars. So in living things, they provide energy. They provide usually a quick form of energy for a living being. Some of these carbohydrates also provide some structural components in cells. So for example, in plants. And we're going to look at that a little bit more. So some other characteristics of carbohydrates is that they exist usually in a ring structure like this. Whenever you see the molecules themselves, they'll have this kind of ring structure. And we'll look at some examples in a minute. From our last video, you saw that all macromolecules can exist as two different forms. They can exist as monomers, which are single units that make up larger units called polymers. Okay. And I'll change our text here for a second. So the monomer form of a carbohydrate is known as a monosaccharide. And what does that mean? Well, mono means one, just like monomer, and saccharide, that means sugar or sweetness. If I say that somebody's being especially saccharine, that means that they're being super sweet. And the polymer form of a carbohydrate is called, well, you guessed it, it is a polysaccharide. Poly meaning many, so many sugars, many sweetnesses together. Well, let's look at some examples of carbohydrates, in particular some monosaccharides. So here's some monosaccharides. This is probably our most important one that you may have heard of before. This is glucose. Glucose is a product of photosynthesis, and in that sense, it's very, very common in biology. The first thing that you'll notice is that it's in that ring structure, and if you were to write out the molecular formula of glucose, it would look like this. It would be C6H12O6, and you can do that by counting up each of the carbons, each of the hydrogens, and each of the oxygens here. Well, there's a unique characteristic about all carbohydrates, and that is all carbohydrates have what we call a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, and that means this is the ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. So just as this glucose has 6 carbons and 6 oxygens, it has double the amount of hydrogens. You can also have, for example, a ribose sugar that is C5H10O5, and it carries on this same ratio of twice as many hydrogens to oxygens and carbons. Another common monosaccharide is fructose. And what you'll notice is that fructose, even though it has a very different shape, actually has the same molecular formula as glucose, that C6H12O6 formula. So these are some examples of monosaccharides. When they start to link together to form the polymer form, polysaccharides, or they start to add together, in the last video we talked about dehydration synthesis. That's the process of adding monosaccharides together to become a polysaccharide, or all monomers to become polymers. Here is a common example of a disaccharide. This is sucrose. This is table sugar. And this is what happens when you put literally a glucose and a fructose together. The molecular formula changes a little bit, but it still maintains that 1 to 2 to 1 structure, the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So table sugar is just glucose and fructose. And as you eat table sugar, it actually breaks down into the monomer forms, into the monosaccharides, and that's where you get your energy from. And then as you continue to add subunits on, you end up with polysaccharides. So here are some common examples of polysaccharides. This is starch. Sometimes it's known as amylose. You'll notice that all of these sugars typically end with that same ending, that OSE ending. So amylose is the regular name for starch. Well, where do you find starch? In some of these examples that we said before, like potatoes or bread or pasta. And starch is actually a storage molecule for plants. So if you think about, for example, a potato, well, the glucose that it's forming through photosynthesis, they may not be using it all the time. So the plants store it as this molecule called starch, this polysaccharide that's made up of individual glucoses here that it can then go back to and use either for energy later or to pass on to later generations. They may include starch in the fruit or the seed. So that's starch. Humans can digest it very, very easily. And when animals store carbohydrates, they actually store them as this molecule here. This is glycogen. Glycogen we often think of as blood sugar. So you have glycogen in your muscles, you have glycogen in your blood, in your liver, but it quickly gets depleted when you're exercising, when you're burning energy very quickly. So just the same way that plants store carbohydrate energy as starch, humans store carbohydrate energy as glycogen. Our next common polysaccharide is cellulose. Cellulose is again subunits of glucose that are bonded together pretty linearly, some branching, but cellulose is actually the most abundant organic molecule on Earth. Anytime you look out the window and you see grass or you see leaves, the majority of it is cellulose. Now, we humans actually can't digest cellulose because it is made as a structural component. It's what gives plants their structure. So when we eat cellulose in our food and don't digest it, that is what we nutritionally refer to as fiber. And we don't we don't have the sufficient gut flora or the right structures within our body to break it down. Some animals do. For example, cows have 4 stomachs, and they can break down cellulose just fine. That's why they're grazing animals. And the last common polysaccharide that we're going to talk about is chitin. This is chitin. What you'll see with chitin is that we now have some additional molecules in here. We have some nitrogen compounds. And chitin is what animals use as a structural carbohydrate or a structural polysaccharide. Chitin is what you would find in exoskeletons. So, for example, in insects or in crabs, crustaceans, shrimp, the exoskeletons of these animals are sugars, but they're not sweet sugars. You'll notice that none of these polysaccharides are sweet. Even our breads that we were talking about before, they're not sweet. They become sweet when you break them down into smaller versions, into monosaccharides or disaccharides, but the long ones, which can literally be hundreds of monomers long, aren't sweet unless they're broken down into their smaller components. All right, and so that's the last one we're going to talk about here. So just to review, we'll go up to the top again. We have carbohydrates. It's one of our 4 types of macromolecules. Its function is for quick energy or as structural components within cells. The monomer form is a monosaccharide. The polymer form is a polysaccharide. And they can add together just like all monomers can. The common ones are glucose and fructose. They have that ring structure. They often end in OSE. They follow that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And then they link together with dehydration synthesis. Some of them can be used as storage molecules. Others can be structural, such as cellulose and chitin. And that's about it. When you don't use the energy in carbohydrates, they often get stored as fats. And fats are what is the second type of macromolecule that we're going to be talking about in the next video. That is fats are lipids. So we'll do our next video on lipids. If you have any questions, let me know, and I can try to answer them in the comments. Thanks.